Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another session of the Thoracic Gurus. And today we are very privileged to have yet another thoracic guru from the north. Dr. Harinder Singh Bedi is a dynamic cardiothoracic surgeon doing some amazing stuff up in Punjab. And he's always publishing things, always coming up with new ideas. His work on 3D printing is much appreciated. I listened to his lecture and was really amazed by the quality of the work he's doing. He is very active, not only as a cardiac surgeon, but he also does a high number of vascular surgeries, and he also does a high number of thoracic surgeries. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he's president-elect of the vascular surgery society.
No, Venus Association.
Venus Association of India. So, sir, we are very privileged to have you with us on this forum. Thank you very much for giving us your precious time. And just to let you know, the audience is a group of a mixed bag, really. There are youngsters who are going for FRCS exams. There are youngsters who are going for FE, BTS exams, DNB, and MCH. In addition to that, we have also got some very senior surgeons who have logged on onto the various platforms. We are relaying live, and we've got login from about 10 countries. So the floor is all yours, sir. Take it over and please enlighten us on neuroendocrine tumors. And I'm really looking forward to sleeve resections, a discussion on sleeve resections. Thank you.
Good evening. Firstly, great platform that you have built for all of us, Ali Zamir, and we are all grateful to you. See, as I said, cometh the problem, cometh the man. So you have been the catalyst, and I'm sure people were just waiting for this. Okay, now today we'll be talking on neuroendocrine tumors. That I'll just be touching on that. And the basic theme of the talk is bronchial carcinoids. And in bronchial carcinoids, we'll be talking mostly on the technique of sleeve resection. Okay. Okay, now I've got to get my slides to work. Why is it stuck? Okay. Okay, so I bring you greetings from my very deeply religious state, and that's where I am located. That is Mohali, or it's actually a tri-city, Mohali, Chandigarh, Panchkula, and we are about 300 kilometers from Delhi.
Sir, little bit louder, sir.
Okay, better? Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So greeting, thank you, Hiremat. Welcome, and great job that you and Ali are doing. So greetings from my city, that is Mohali and Chandigarh. That's my hospital. It's a chain. And that we have a multi-specialty hospital. So that's, I think, very important that you should have a group of people working with you when you are planning to do some high-level surgery. And that's our team, various parts of our team. And the backbone of our team is these Florence Nightingale, and some of them have been with me for the past 30 years, and they're at various levels of training. That's our ICU. That's one of the operation theaters I had designed, and that's my current theater, where we do mostly cardiac, but about 20% we do our thoracic cases. Okay, as I said, a very vibrant state and a deeply religious state. So, okay, now let's get on to our talk, which is on neuroendocrine tumors. Is the sound okay now? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. So now neuroendocrine tumors, basically, obviously, they're tumors which arise from the cells of the neuroendocrine system. This is something that we are not much familiar with. So basically, these are cells that receive input, neural input, and as the output, they release molecules, that is hormones. So they basically bring an integration between the nervous and the endocrine system. And they're found in the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the adrenals, the pancreas, and the appendix, and the tracheobronchial tree. So there are basically two varieties. One are those tumors which are of the neuroendocrine organs, by which we mean the pancreas, and they are called the PNET, that is the pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors, adrenal pheochromocytomas, paragangliomas, and the other is the what we'll be talking about, tumors of the dispersed endocrine cells, which includes the tracheobronchial or the bronchopulmonary along with the GI tract. And just to make it clear at this stage, when we say all these tumors are malignant, when we say carcinoid, we refer to neuroendocrine tumors of the dispersed endocrine system only, that is of the GI tract and the tracheobronchial tree and the thyroid. We are not talking of pancreas and the adrenal medulla, etc. So basically, they are all slow growing tumors. I already said they're mostly in the GI tract and in the lung. They belong to they are neuroendocrine tumors. They were detected in the 1800s and named as carcinoid in 1907, when they were thought that it is something in between a carcinoma and an adenoma. There is something called a multiple endocrine neoplasia, or a MEN, sort of a syndrome. There's 1, 2A, and 2B, and these are of mostly of the pituitary adenoma, pituitary or the parathorax. And just to something of current interest, that one of our very prominent actors, he had this one of the neuroendocrine tumors, and he died of a complication. Okay, let's get back to carcinoid. So these are well differentiated neuroendocrine tumors of the dispersed endocrine system. Most of them are non-functional, so you won't get the usual symptoms of carcinoid syndrome or Cushing syndrome with these carcinoid tumors. Otherwise, the classical carcinoid syndrome is basically either cutaneous flush, cough and wheeze and dyspnea, diarrhea and cramps, and of our interest that they can also damage the heart, that is pulmonary and tricuspid valve stenosis, and something very rare, endocardial fibrosis. If some of my friends from Kerala will remember, endomyocardial fibrosis or EMF used to be a disease found mostly in Kerala at some time when I was doing my MCH, and the exact reason for that was not known at that time. It's probably not, it was not related to carcinoid syndrome. It was possibly related to something in the diet or the local. Okay, now bronchopulmonary carcinoid tumors, let's come out to the main part of the topic. They are the most well differentiated and least biological aggressive neuroendocrine tumor. So if you have to have a tumor, it would be a carcinoid tumor, and they grow very slowly. They tend to metastasize very infrequently, and they arise from cells which are known as Kulchitsky cells. Now this is very interesting. This gentleman was a Russian anatomist, and during the revolution in Russia, probably 1918, he was arrested, as were a number of other academicians. And later on, then he was released, of course. Then he went to UK. He worked in London in the University College. And something again very tragic. He just had a fall one day, which they don't know why, and he died of it. So that's he was the one who discovered the Kulchitsky cells. He discovered it in the intestine. And these are the cells which produce neuroendocrine tumors. So basically, the bronchial carcinoids, we call them, or we classify them into two, that is typical, which is slow growing, and the atypical, which is little more aggressive. As such, the carcinoids of the lung, of the tracheobronchial pulmonary tree, account for just 1 to 2% of all lung tumors. So they are quite rare actually. And they are about 1/3 to 1/4 of all carcinoids. So that's the sort of statistic that you're looking at. So 1/4 to 1/3 of all carcinoid tumors, and just 1 or 2% of all lung tumors. In children, they are probably the most frequent primary pulmonary neoplasm. So as I said, bronchial carcinoids are typical, which is 90%. We call them TC, or atypical, which is 10%. I'll tell you what the difference is. Typical are usually in the 4th to 5th decade of life, but can occur at any time. There is no connection of this is one of the few tumors of the tracheobronchial tree of the lung, which is not related to smoking. And they can be central or they can be peripheral. Very few of them, that is 1 to 5%, will present with a carcinoid syndrome, which I told you, flushing, diarrhea, palpitation. So carcinoid syndrome per se is rare in carcinoid tumors. They are highly organized. On microscope, you will find very rare mitosis. They'll grow slowly, and very rarely will they go beyond the lungs. As I said, 90% are typical, so that's the best tumor to have. 5-year survival is pretty good. Most serious 87 to 95%, in some even up to 100%. As opposed to that, there are atypical carcinoids, more mitotic activity, grow faster, go to the lymph nodes, and the 5-year survival is obviously low, 40 to 59%. So I've already told you the typical carcinoids, well differentiated, slow growing, atypical, more aggressive, faster growing, worse prognosis. The location can be central in the trachea, bronchus, or peripheral, and patient can be asymptomatic or will present with mostly symptoms due to the lesion per se, not due to the hormone production of the lesion. And this is what you see in gross. You know, there's this tumor in the trachea or the bronchus, mainstem, usually in the mainstem bronchus. It can be dark red or tan yellow. It's very, very vascular. When we take a biopsy, we are always worried that we may produce, and it does bleed actually, and mostly found within the cartilaginous part of the tracheobronchial tree. They're covered with intact bronchial epithelium. They're very vascular, pink or purplish, and usually have a broad base, but occasionally there may be a distinct stalk also. So I've already told you 1/3 to 1/4 of all carcinoids, that is 25 to 30%, are bronchial. 1 to 2% of lung tumors are carcinoids. Female male is almost similar, slightly more females. Age 40 to 50 years, but can affect all ages. Prognosis very good for the typical carcinoids. Not so, and we have something called immunohistochemistry, which is done off the biopsy that you take, and it's very specific, very sensitive, like chromogranin A. You can, if you find that, that's a diagnostic, and also you can prognosticate on the basis of the IHC. So there are various tumor markers that you can find. You have to ask your pathologist to look for. Atypical have a predilection to attack smokers, and they, as I told you, they are a little bit more associated with Cushing syndrome and something called the Eaton-Lambert syndrome, which is an autoimmune muscular dystrophy, and more of lymph node metastasis. Now, a little bit about genetics. Now, you know, everything is related to genes, and I firmly believe at some time we will know which gene causes what, and we will be able to manipulate that gene and produce a cure. And my son is a scientist, and he tells me that this is not very far off. So, okay, in the carcinoids, you have, there is a change or a mutation or a difference in the DNA, which can be 11q, 10q, or 13q. And we can prognosticate. That is, if you have a mutation of 10q and 13q, then probably it's more aggressive. And this can have bearing on our treatment. Risk factors, as I said, none known. Not the typical are not related to smoking. No specific family history. Yes, if you have a multiple endocrine neoplasia, you may be at, or you have a tuberous sclerosis, you may be at an increased risk of a bronchial carcinosis. Symptoms, if it is central, it will block the tracheal bronchial tree, cause cough, hemoptysis, and rarely can cause symptoms like asthma or can cause shortness of breath. And it will, of course, produce a pneumonia if not treated in time. Peripheral carcinoids may be asymptomatic. Carcinoid syndrome per se in very few patients, and Cushing's syndrome, Cushing disease, also in very few of the bronchial carcinoids. The diagnosis, X-ray, you may be normal or may be causing collapse of a part or the whole of the lung. CT scan will be diagnostic, will show the lesion, will show the lymph nodes, and also something I've been very happy with, that is virtual bronchoscopy. We'll show you pictures of that. Then, of course, you must do a bronchoscopy, and that will show you the tumor and where it originates from. If you can go beyond it, you can see the length of the tumor, and you will, of course, need to take a biopsy. Endobronchial ultrasonography can be done. Biopsy, of course, is required. PET scan is not at all required because these are very slow growing tumors and the optic will not be good. In the biopsy, you must do an immunohistochemistry. Then there are some tumor markers in the blood which can be there, and like 5-hydroxyindole acetic acid, 5-HIIA, and of course cortisol and ACTH and growth hormones. You should always look for these also. Again, they have a prognostic implication. Biopsy, of course, of the tissue itself. You may be able to do a sputum cytology also, but finally you do need a biopsy, which should be bronchoscopic. Other methods are endobronchial ultrasound guided, CT guided needle biopsy, and of course, if nothing works, then you may do a biopsy during the surgery itself. Radionuclide studies can be done. Some of these tumors are avid to somatostatin receptor, so that's called a somatostatin receptor scintigraphy, or SRS, or a octreoscan, which is octreotide is a hormone-like substance that attaches to the carcinoid cells. And these can be picked up, and they are useful for, again, especially if you're following up the patient or you're looking for secondaries or recurrence, and for staging also. Pulmonary function test, of course, if you're going to operate on them, you need to have a pulmonary function test. Treatment, you have to treat as for a malignancy, that is a complete dissection along with lymph node sampling. You want to, since they are slow growing tumors, you want to spare as much of the lung as possible. So parenchymal sparing surgical resection plus lymph nodes. In atypical, again, you would like to spare as much as possible of the lung tissue along with lymph node dissection. There's a very limited role for radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and other analogs. They do not actually improve long-term outcome. So for central carcinoids, the treatment is sleeve resection plus lymph node dissection. For peripheral, it's a wedge resection. And sometimes if you're not able to conserve tissue, then it's a lobectomy, rarely a pneumonectomy. Very rarely, you may do a bronchoscopic resection or a laser surgery. This is not curative because we know that we can't do anything for the lymph nodes. And we know that the tumor it will grow into the bronchial wall, so that you can't remove the whole part of that. It is only very limited indications for a small, very small, tiny carcinoid with no lymph nodes on CT. Or if you want to, if there's almost a complete obstruction and you want to just prepare the patient for a day or so, you want to get past the obstruction, or if the patient is not fit for surgery, palliation can be done. So very limited indication for endoscopic resection or laser therapy. Chemo and radiotherapy are really not much role. They do not improve the long-term survival. And basically, they are for inoperable cases or for recurrences in a typical disease where it is inoperable, or just for palliation. Follow-up, of course, you have to follow them every year, or at least clinically you have to follow them. CT scan only if you have a suspicion of recurrence. Contraindication only if the patient is not able to tolerate the procedure or there's a widespread disease. So if it's advanced stage, otherwise all patients should have surgery for carcinoid tumors. Now let's come to what I actually want to talk about, and that's how to do the resection. And before that, you need to know the anatomy. I'm sure you all have been taught anatomy in some of the previous lectures, so I'll be short. That's the right mainstem bronchus, which continues almost in more of a direct line, gives off the upper lobe bronchus, and then you have a fairly long segment of bronchus intermedius before it gives off anteriorly the middle lobe bronchus, and then of course the lower lobe. So if you have a tumor here, then you can easily dissect that part and re-anastomose the bronchus. As opposed to the left side, which is a little more acute, and the left main bronchus is longer. So any tumor here is very amenable to a sleeve resection. And then, of course, we get the left upper lobe and the right and the left lower lobe bronchus. So this is very, very important to have a knowledge, intricate knowledge of the anatomy. And in the lungs, the left and the right sides are quite different. So you have to know, of course, very clearly the anatomy of the left and right side. Now, this is one slide I'm very happy with. And if there's anybody who wants to, this slide, I can share it with you and just see the slide, spend about 20 seconds on it. Shows you very nicely the relationship of the trachea, the pulmonary veins, the pulmonary arteries, and all the surrounding tissues. And once you have this in your mind, you have a 3D picture in your mind, then I'm sure you can do most surgeries of the lung. You can do, basically it's dissection and good care of the tissues, whether you do open surgery or you do bad surgery. So this is one of the very good slides, and I'll be happy to share it with anybody. So again, anatomy, because this area is so dense with so many important structures, you have to know, and the left and right are so different. For example, on the left side, you have the recurrent laryngeal nerve just where the left main bronchus is, right over here. While on the right side, at least the recurrent is far away, but you have a different type of anatomy. Generally, the left bronchus is deep within the pulmonary artery and the aorta, and you have to go right deep into the tissues to get down to the left main bronchus. That takes a little bit of knowledge of anatomy and good surgical skills. So whenever I go for a little more than a simple, actually there's nothing like simple surgery, but whenever I go for a sleeve resection, I spend good 5 to 10 minutes to just brush up on my anatomy. As opposed, if I'm going to do a CABG, I might, most of us don't need to actually brush up, because, that's relatively, if you compare CABG to lung surgery, there's no competition. Lung surgery is much more challenging. And there are various types of resection of limited parenchymal resection that you can do, depending on what is the location of the tumor. And the commonest that we do, and that I'll be talking to you, is on the left side, sleeve of the left main bronchus. So you remove the bronchus and re-anastomose it of the healthy tissues. On the right side, when you remove it, generally the upper lobe is involved because it's very close. So it's almost impossible to preserve the upper lobe if it's a right main stem bronchus. So you have to remove the upper lobe with the bronchus. So these are the two common types of sleeve lobectomies. Now, I'm sure you know this, who this gentleman is. This is the only minus point of this type of presentation, that I don't know, I can't see you, and I can't ask questions. So that's Dr. Hermes Grillo. He is the father of tracheal surgery. And a little bit of interesting, I like history, so a little bit of interesting facts about him. That he was in Boston, and until '83 he was fairly active. He developed various surgical protocols. He was also a part of the army contingent that had gone to Korea, and he died at the age of 83, not of cardiac arrest or anything. He was driving. He and his wife were driving. They were enjoying themselves in Italy. And in, I think, 2006, he had a car accident and he died. So that's Hermes Grillo, the father of tracheal and bronchial surgery. Sleeve resection, first described by Griffith for a stricture in 1947. And then Price Thomas, he operated on a person who went on and became an RAF officer in the Air Force. He did it in 1947, but reported in 1957. So it took a long time to report it. And then almost similar time in USA, Paulson and Shaw also described this. So this is the history of sleeve resection. Principles of sleeve resections, very important. It's please understand, it is not an adenoma. It is a cancer. It is a carcinoma. It's a malignant tumor. So your transection lines should be clean. Minimal handling of mucosa. You should avoid the cautery, no cautery at all when you're touching the bronchus. And the sutures have to be, for any bronchial surgery, sutures have to be exact, they have to be precise. Last thing you need is a bronchopleural fistula. The only difference from a standard malignancy is that the free margin, you can have a smaller or a shorter free margin, just 1 or 2 millimeters, while in a otherwise a malignancy you would like a little longer free margin, because we know it's a low local recurrence rate. So and the tissues are very precious over there. So just if you have 1 to 2 millimeter away from tumor, that is enough. And of course you have to do a lymph node dissection. Anastomosis on the left side is very technically demanding. There are no staplers at this point in time. We have to do manual. It's a very narrow field. You saw that there is aorta, there is pulmonary artery, there is recurrent laryngeal nerve, and there is no place for imperfection. You have to do it right the first time. So let's take you through a few cases. We have done very few. I have done about 10 cases now, and each case has been a challenge. One of the patients, an 11-year-old boy who was seen in pediatric surgery, and we did it together, had a history of respiratory infections which were not really looked after well, till finally somebody picked up that he had something more than just a pneumonia. And he had features of consolidation collapse, and that's his X-ray. You can see the whole of the left lung is collapsed. There is pulling of the mediastinum and the trachea. That's an air bronchogram, complete obstruction of the left main bronchus. Same thing, you can see left main bronchus is closed. Nowadays we get fancy reconstructions from CT, and that's really very helpful. Our colleagues in CT, I am sure that if you're not doing it, you must go to the console, go and spend 5 to 10 minutes with the radiologist whenever you're treating anything which needs a precise knowledge of what the pathology is as relation to the anatomy. That's a virtual bronchoscopy. Again, I'm amazed at the clarity. You can see the left main bronchus just after the carina. That's a complete block, and it's really wonderful what all you can see with the virtual bronchoscopy. Of course, then we did a bronchoscopy, did a biopsy. It bled a little bit, and we sprayed some adrenaline, epinephrine on it, and it luckily stopped and showed a typical bronchial carcinoid. And it's very easy for the pathologist of uniform round tumor cells and infiltrating into the bronchial wall. We did a immunohistochemistry, and that was positive for most of the markers. And a whole body skeletal scan was also done. I'm not sure whether that is standard to make sure that there are no secondaries, and there were none. Now, please look at this slide. I don't know how clear it is. I'll see if I can make it bigger. And there are a number of good things that you can make out from this slide. Yes. One is the importance of documentation. Two is that whenever you have a doubt, please do not hesitate to consult somebody who you know is better than you in that particular field. So this is way back 6-7 years back, 2014. For this patient only, I was not very confident, although I had done a few of sleeve dissections. So I contacted Dr. Ali Zamir, and he was very kind enough. He gave me his opinion about what should be done. So what I'm telling you is that, one, this shows the importance of documentation. We must, preserve our documents and be thankful to people who have helped us. And two, never let your ego come in the way. If you don't know something as well as the next person, please take the opinion of the next person. So Dr. Zamir, I don't know whether you remember this, but that's the document.
Yes, sir, I remember this. Thank you for showing it.
Yes. So that's what we did. Of course, it has to be a single lung. We intubated the right bronchus, left posterolateral thoracotomy, bed of the fourth rib. Always when you're operating on the lung resection, always the inferior pulmonary ligament should be freed. And always when you're freeing it, don't get tempted to just use the long cautery, because quite often there is a vessel in it. And I have burnt my fingers once, and people senior to me have told us, don't ever just divide the inferior pulmonary ligament. You must transfix it. So always free the inferior pulmonary ligament. That gives you a lot of leeway, a lot of space for the lung to expand. On the left side, we had to mobilize the aorta, main pulmonary artery. There was the ligamentum. Again, don't just divide the ligamentum, transfix it. Sometimes it may be patent, and that can be, blood, egg on your face. Recurrent laryngeal nerve, very, very important. I'll spend a few moments on that in the slide section also. You cannot, I repeat, damage the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Unless, of course, it's totally encased in a tumor, because patient will have immediate hoarseness of voice, and that is something which you do not want. From the left side, it is amazing that you can go right up to the trachea. Of course, left bronchus is there, and even the right main bronchus can be taped, and you pull everything towards you. Then it's a piece of cake, not a problem. Otherwise, it's such a narrow angle that you will not be able to do an anastomosis unless you mobilize everything. So then we removed the sleeve of the bronchus with the carcinoid, sent it immediately for frozen section. And meanwhile, we did lymph node sampling also, which was also sent for frozen section. In between, you go out and have a cup of tea. And then when the frozen section gave us the okay, we anastomosed the bronchus, the distal bronchus, to the left main. Actually, there was hardly any left main bronchus left. It was almost the carina. And the suture, preferable suture, is PDS. This is a synthetic monofilament absorbable suture. It takes 6 months to get completely absorbed. So that is the best thing to do. On the left side, I don't usually use a buttress unless it's a post-radiotherapy or a bad diabetic, because the bronchus is going to be covered with the pulmonary artery, with the aorta once it falls back. And to relieve tension, besides the inferior pulmonary ligament, you do something called a pericardial release. This is a very beautiful method of getting at least 2 centimeters of mobility so that there is no tension on the anastomosis. It's a U-shaped incision below the inferior pulmonary vein. I'll show it to you. Then on table, you do a flexible bronchoscopy to check your anastomosis and also suck out the secretions distally. There. Now this, again, I'll spend a little time. That's the aorta, that's the left thoracotomy. And these are huge number of tissues in a very small space. That's the ligamentum, you have to transfix it. There are a few intercostal arteries here. If you feel they are coming in the way, you may transfix them, but generally it is not required. But if required, you can do to 1 or 2, not big arteries. If they're smallish, medium-sized arteries, you can transfix them. Look for and save the vagus nerve. Look for and save the recurrent laryngeal nerve. You cannot damage the recurrent laryngeal nerve. And the bronchus is going to be here. It's a very tiny area. That's the same patient. We are looking from the surgeon side. So the red is the aorta. The blue is the left pulmonary artery. Over here, we'll find the bronchus. Once we reach over there, that's the recurrent laryngeal nerve. The yellow is the vagus nerve. So please imprint this in your mind. There are some structures which you have to dissect. As you can see over here, we are using the CABG retractor, the Mackay retractor, because it was a child and not very deep. So that's almost the same thing in a pictorial diagram as what you're seeing over here in the actual operative picture. So that's the pulmonary. The blue is the pulmonary artery. So you pull it down, aorta, you pull it up, and everything is right in front of you. You tape the left main bronchus, the trachea, and sometimes you are able to tape the right main bronchus also, like over here. That's the left main bronchus over there. That's the right main bronchus, and that's the trachea. And once you tape it, then everything comes into view, and it becomes safer for the patient and for you. Because if this thing were to disappear down, I really don't know what you would do if you had that. You can't afford to lose the tissue into the mediastinum, so that would be a disaster. So there are various pictures of what we actually did, and this is, you can see, you can lift up the trachea. You can actually tape the right main bronchus from the left side. So this is something which at times we may not be aware of. Now we have removed a sleeve of the bronchus. The lung is lying free in the chest cavity. That's the endotracheal tube you're seeing, which is going on to the opposite. That is the right main bronchus. This is the sleeve. So it's a sleeve with 1 to 2 millimeter of free margin on either side, which you send immediately for frozen section. Suturing is very important. You have to first suture the cartilaginous part. Very precise sutures, 3 millimeter deep, 3 to 4 millimeter apart. Knots, of course, have to be on the outside. Suture is a good suture we have. That is a PDS absorbable, long-lasting, up to 6 months it takes to get absorbed. At the back, we did continuous sutures. You can do interrupted at the back also. And in front, we did all interrupted. You could do all interrupted also. Little discrepancy in size, not much, and that you can compensate as you go along. You can telescope also a little bit. And then there was some tension on the anastomosis, not much. And we took care of it by already having divided the inferior pulmonary ligament, and later on, we divided the pericardium around the inferior pulmonary vein. So that takes it up. We did not plan and did not do a coverage as the bronchial anastomosis was embedded in deep vascular tissue. And of course, like in all bronchial surgeries, we check the anastomosis by the water leak test and did a bronchoscopy. So that's the final result that you see. That's almost the carina. That's the right main bronchus towards the carina. That's the left main bronchus. This is the part of the left main bronchus which is left after we have removed the tumor, and these are the sutures we are passing. That's the pulmonary artery, that's the aorta. So again, you see it's a very tiny, narrow area that we're working in. Now about the pericardial release, this is a very good step to know, especially since we are trained in both cardiac and thoracic, and it's no big deal for us. And the incision is over here, below the inferior pulmonary vein. This whole thing opens up, and the tension on the bronchial anastomosis significantly. Let's see if we can run this. So that's the thoracotomy. We are taping the structures, vagus nerve, pulmonary artery blue, and that's the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Don't touch it, don't catch it. You can just hook it, don't catch it. Showing the bronchus, we have taped the bronchus and the trachea, removed a piece of the bronchus with the carcinoid. In between, we I don't know, we didn't need to. We ventilated the lung with direct intubation. You don't need to do that. And that's the completed anastomosis. That's the inferior, the pericardial release. You can see the heart, pericardium has been opened. That's the left atrial appendage. That's the inferior pulmonary vein. So it's almost like when you're doing a CMB. And that's the pericardium. Of course, you end up opening the pericardium, but then you need that little less stress on the anastomosis. So that's a pericardial release, a good technique to know. Only damage is that you may, infect the pericardial space, should not normally, because it's a clean surgery. And that's showing the final result, looking into and testing the bronchial anastomosis. There, we already saw that. So let's go forward. Again, showing you the importance of the recurrent laryngeal nerve. We have a small video again over here, there. So yellow is vagus nerve, blue is pulmonary artery, red is the aorta. And look for the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Don't touch it with the forceps, but you can sort of hook it up and make sure, it's not damaged. So that's the anastomosis in progress. That's the anterior layer, which is interrupted. Posterior can be continuous. And that's the anastomosis. And that's the biopsy. This is a same thing, same biopsy. This is on that was into 200, and this is into 400, showing it's a as far as the pathologist says, it's a they can't miss it. And so this is the post-operative X-ray at a later stage. This is 1 month follow-up. So of course, kid did well, and he still comes. He's a grown-up fellow now, in his 20s. And since this was actually a pediatric surgeon's case, and we had been called to help them out, and they got it published in one of the journals. Similar case we did, then we've done a fair number. This is an adult 25-year-old lady. You can see the malignancy on the left side. And here we had to remove we had to remove the upper lobe also. Now let's see on the right side here we had a young male, non-smoker, presented with dyspnea and hemoptysis. That's, showing the very classical bronchial carcinoid in the right main bronchus. You can see that very clearly. And again, virtual bronchoscopy. This I had done when we were in the Christian Medical College, Ludhiana. You can see over here that's a complete occlusion of the right main bronchus just after the carina. And then, of course, we did a biopsy which showed a typical carcinoid. And this is what we ended up doing. The tumor was here, so there was no way that we could have spared the right upper lobe. So we did a right upper lobectomy with sleeve resection of the main bronchus. I'll take you through some of the steps. So that's the sleeve of the right bronchus with the tumor and along with the right upper lobe. So you have to mostly, in the right side, you have to sacrifice the right upper lobe, although the lung per se is normal. So I'm sure in some lesions, you may be able to reattach the right upper lobe also. In this patient, we had wanted to put a buttress. And so before you put in the retractor, you make this intercostal muscle buttress over here. Nowadays, what I do is I use the internal mammary artery, and we call that the IMA buttress. In this patient, we use the intercostal. As you can see over here, this is the intercostal muscle, which you have to make before you retract the chest, or before you put a retractor and crank the chest. Otherwise, it will just it'll just get squashed. So you need a good muscle mass. So we've removed the upper lobe, the right main stem bronchus, along with the upper lobe. So that's the pulmonary artery branches to the upper lobe. That's what is left. You can see the endotracheal tube going into the left side. That's the zygous vein, which sometimes you may have to ligate for a better exposure. And that's the residual lung. That is the middle and the lower lobe on the right side. So that's the specimen which goes immediately for frozen section. That's the tumor that you can see. And this is the intercostal muscle flap, which we have as a vascular flap. We use it to buttress the bronchial anastomosis. So I'll take you through some of these slides, the videos. That's a sleeve with the tumor and the right upper lobe. He was a non-smoker, but he had bad lungs, very black lungs. And another part of the procedure where you can see the endotracheal tube right over there. There you can see the buttress that we have already prepared, and it's just floating over there. That's the part of the lung which we are going to conserve. And that's the completed anastomosis. Middle lobe, lower lobe. This is bronchus intermedius to the main bronchus. Again, almost going to the carina. That's the intercostal muscle flap. I'm quite happy with this flap also, but not in all patients. And I would recommend the internal mammary artery buttress because that's a much thicker muscle mass. And here you're testing it, as we all do, the bronchial anastomosis, to make sure that it is leak proof. And then in some patients, you may, and this is not my patient, you may, if the tumor has invaded the pulmonary artery and you still want to do a conservative or a parenchymal sparing operation, you can, it's called double sleeve resection. That is, you remove the bronchus sleeve and a sleeve of pulmonary artery also, along with upper lobectomy. Complications like for any bronchial resection, lung resection is basically, besides infection, it's dehiscence of the anastomosis. So you have to be careful, fistula and a late stricture. So a little bit about the suturing. Of course, tie it carefully, should not be too much tension. Check it with the nerve hook. 40 PDS suture is what we used. It's absorbable, synthetic, monofilament, and do a bronchoscopy. Sometimes, I've never seen it, but sometimes you may have a loose loop inside. You should never have it, but you may have. So operation theater is the best place to correct it rather than thinking later on. Various types of techniques, all interrupted or posterior continuous and anterior interrupted, or one single layer, which we don't recommend because if there's a partial dehiscence, the whole thing will go. And another technique which I came across and I used in 1 or 2 patients was you use 3 stitches and running stitches and tie them to each other. So here the tightness is distributed and along the whole circumference, and it saves time. So I'll just show you this. It was presented by this group from Italy, 2009. That's what they do. They take 3 sutures. So one, you run this down, you run this down, and the third one is over here, and then you tie them to each other. So main advantage is that the tension is distributed, and time probably, time, yes, will be less, although I don't think just saving 5-6 minutes is of a major consequence. People who are well versed with VATS, surgery can be done with VATS. The only little problem is of the suturing because we don't have staples. Sometime we may have, or maybe Dr. Zamir will tell us if staples are already there that you can anastomose a bronchus to a bronchus. But VATS can be done. I have no experience of VATS in sleeve lobectomy. What do you do for recurrences? Can be local, can be distant. If it's local, another surgery. Results are very good. Of course, if you can't do that, then a radiation therapy, chemotherapy does not make a major difference. And there's something new which is coming up, which I'll talk to you about. That is the future. So the various studies are in progress. The aim is to identify prognostic markers that you could tell that which patient is going to do well, even if you just do a bronchoscopic resection, or some patient is likely to be an aggressive tumor, and so you may have to do a little more aggressive surgery. So progress in identifying different markers now. Similarly, if you find a marker which shows that this carcinoid is not going to grow for the next 30 years, then you may just, instead of a surgery, you may just remove it with an endoscope or with a laser. For atypical carcinoids, marker shows that the prognosis is going to be bad. We may try some new specific drugs or targeted therapy, which I'll talk to you about, and you can individualize the treatment for each patient. So this is something new. This I got to know from my colleague who is in radiotherapy. That is PRRT, peptide receptor radionuclide therapy for widespread disease. Basically, you have a radiation with a lutetium-177, and this is possible in those patients where the tumor has somatostatin receptors, which can be found out preoperatively. There are some drugs which have tumors, and if somebody has an aggressive bronchial carcinoid, he may be put on a trial with these drugs. Beside this, you have something called angiogenesis inhibitors, which affect the growth of new blood vessels. That is, they stop angiogenesis. So if you can stop angiogenesis at the site of the tumor, then the tumor will stop growing or might regress also. So again, this is something which is coming up with research and in various trials. Researchers are looking to try to improve upon drugs related to somatostatin or better than somatostatin. That is, one of them is pasireotide, which is more potent, especially for pancreatic nets. There's another one called edotriotide. So there's some drugs which are coming up which are hormonal drugs, and you can tag a radioactive atom to these drugs. It will go where the tumor is, whether it is in the lung or it is a secondary, and it will deliver the radiation where the tumor is. So that's targeted therapy. So I think we'll wind up here. All pulmonary carcinoids they are and they should be treated as malignancies. They are not adenomas. And the cure is possible with surgical resection as long as there is no distant metastasis. And you must try and preserve parenchyma. This is actually true for any surgery of the lung. Wherever possible, we must preserve parenchyma, but you have to follow the principles of oncosurgery. Just because it is a low-growing, slow-growing cancer does not mean that you not follow the principles of oncosurgery. So parenchymal sparing surgery, sleeve resection is a fantastic technique to know whenever you are treating any resection of the lung tissue. And the considerations, of course, as for any disease, as for any treatment, you have to think of the patient, the disease, the operation, and then take a decision. Left and right sides are totally, quite different, and as far as the anatomy is concerned, not otherwise. And if it's a technically little demanding surgery, but not at all difficult, and when carried out by an experienced team, the results are excellent. So thank you very much. And the lung is paradoxically, as you can see in this lovely diagram, it's a very delicate, but also an organ which is very resilient. So if you do your procedure appropriately, then the lung bounces back. So thank you very much. And I'm ready for any discussion and interaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bedi. That was an excellent presentation. Can I ask you to stop sharing your screen so we'll get your video?
I can't hear you.
Could you please stop sharing your screen? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
Okay, so now we'll get you in and
yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bedi. May I tell you that I was monitoring the audience input into your lecture. And over the last many months, we've been having these lectures. The dropout rate has been around 50%. Your dropout rate was 0%. We started with a full house and we are still with a full house. There has not been a single dropout actually in your lecture. So obviously you are doing something right.
Thank you.
Excellent talk, sir.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. Just a few things which I think would be worth discussing because we've got some exam going students and things like that. So I'd like to make a few comments first before I start with questions. Is that okay with you, sir?
Of course, of course.
Yeah, sure. So now in the oncology world, the term carcinoid tumor is actually not used. The term carcinoid and atypical carcinoid is increasingly not being used. This is for the FRCS exam goings and the DNB exam going. So if you want to describe the tumor, the word that is used is a G1, G2, or a G3 tumor. So G1 is, these are called as neuroendocrine tumors. That's the word that is used. Carcinoid increase, all textbooks say carcinoid, but now if you read the newer literatures, they call them neuroendocrine tumor, NET. And so a typical carcinoid tumor is called as G1. An atypical carcinoid tumor is called as G2. And neuroendocrine carcinomas are called as G3. So how do you know what is G1, G2, G3? Actually, it's a histological classification. And if on the basis of histology, if you have less than 2 mitoses per 10 high power field, then it's a G1 and no necrosis. That's a G1. A G2 is 2 to 10 mitoses per 10 high power field. And a G3 is more than 10 mitoses per high power field. So this is just for the exam people. You must know that that if somebody asks you in the exam, what is the histological classification? It is G1, G2, G3. So low grade, intermediate grade, and high grade. So it's very important to know this concept that the word NET is being used for bronchial carcinoids rather than carcinoids. So if you've got a newer examiner who has read up a lot, he will ask you this question. Particularly in the oncology multidisciplinary team meetings, this is the word that is used to describe a carcinoid. Sir, I want to ask you a question in your things. You mentioned something about carcinoid syndromes. So what is the significance of carcinoid syndromes in bronchial or GI carcinoid tumor? Do everybody get it, or is it some specific group that we have to worry about when you have carcinoid syndrome?
Yes, see, carcinoid syndrome is very rare in the bronchial carcinoid, the bronchial nets.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you do look for the markers when in the preoperative scanning. If the syndrome is there, then the patient will give a history of flushing, of wheezing, which may be missed. You may think that it is due to obstruction, or he may have a symptom of diarrhea, or he could have Cushing syndrome also, that is hirsutism, gain of weight, and all that. So it's not very common.
Yeah. So
none of my patients I never had.
Yeah, sure. It's present in about 10% of people actually, of all carcinoids, not just bronchial. I'm talking about all carcinoids. The one thing is, if you've got a pulmonary carcinoid with a carcinoid syndrome like features, then you must think about liver metastasis. Usually bronchial carcinoids only give you symptoms of a carcinoid syndrome when the liver gets involved. So there is this concept of prehepatic and posthepatic. So when it is prehepatic, you can get a carcinoid syndrome. When it is posthepatic, you do not get a carcinoid syndrome. So whenever you have a patient with a primary lung carcinoid and he gives you a symptom of diarrhea, flushing, and things like that, you must look for metastases in the liver. It's an early sign which tells you that that something is actually going on in the liver. So it's just for the postgraduates. I just want to highlight this point for them. If they have a case in the exam, it would give them much more validity when they put this point across to the examiner. So other thing that you said was you were not keen on a PET scan actually for carcinoids. In our practice, it is actually completely the opposite. We are very keen on PET scan because NICE guidelines also says that you should not operate on anybody without a PET scan. The one thing with carcinoid tumors is that the PET that you do is not FDG PET. You do not use FDG PET. You use a PET called as DOTA PET, D-O-T-A. And the DOTA stands for dodecane tetraacetic acid. I'm sorry, it's just the full form of that, but DOTA is the word that you have to remember. This is specific for the SSTR receptor. And the reason why I mentioned DOTA PET is because, sir, you said there is now newer therapies with the lutetium-177. And lutetium-177 radiotherapy actually attaches itself to the SSTR receptor of the carcinoid tumor. And that is why it's very important to do preoperative DOTA, because we have accurate analysis of sensitivity to post-operative radiotherapy if required with lutetium. Because sometimes you may think that you've got a resection margin negative, and you've finished your sting, and the final histology may come back as a lymph node positive. So if a lymph node comes back positive in a localized area, you might have to give lutetium-177 as a therapy. And if you have not done a preoperative DOTA, then you are none the wiser about postoperative issues. That is why the recommendation nowadays in the oncology world is that even if you're operating on a simple carcinoid, you must actually do a DOTA PET, D-O-T-A, DOTA PET. That's quite important. And there are some papers which are saying you can do a combined PET, which is an 18 FTG plus a DOTA PET. that also gives you equally good sensitivity. It's only a matter of giving 2 injections rather than 1 injection. But there
I
is
think
evidence coming up.
yeah, that's a very good point, because important for prognostication,
Yes,
important for
absolutely.
planning your therapy. So
Yeah,
important.
absolutely. I think it is important. So it's now become a part of the guidelines now almost, that DOTAPET should be done. In terms of your suturing, I really love the way you showed the suturing on the left side. Beautiful, sir. Beautiful, amazing. And the one point which I just wanted to make was, you really very nicely highlighted that the key to the left side sleeve resection is to dissect the ligamentum arteriosum and cut it. I think once you dissect the ligamentum arteriosum, it all opens up like a book. The pulmonary artery goes down, the aorta goes up, and then the whole passage inside gives you access to the left main bronchus and the carina. And so you're absolutely right. I love that video. It is beautiful, sir. The way you showed that demonstration was amazing. Of course, we fortunately have access to VATS and robotics and things like that. And robotics is just exceptionally good for any complex resection like this. So we do use robotics for doing sleeve resections. It's really technically almost the way you were doing your open resection and I could see your suturing. That is the same way you can replicate suturing on a robotic platform. So I personally use robot when it's more complex resections. So for sleeve resection, robot is just an ideal tool because A, it gives you an extremely magnified view, and B, most importantly, the dexterity of the surgical instrument allows you to suture very well. And the one point that you mentioned is PDS. I agree with you. PDS is a great tool for doing sleeve resection, for any suturing around the bronchus. PDS as a suture. But now on the robotic platforms and endoscopic platforms, we use a V-lock. So V-lock is like a barbed suture. It comes from Covidien. So the advantage of a barbed suture is that it has got multiple barbs along the suture. So you can go forward with the suture, but it doesn't slip back. The barbs hold it back, like a fish hook it's got. So the barb suture allows you to suture in a semi-continuous pattern, and then you can use another one on the front and then join the two, or you can use 3 as you showed in your paper. Using 3 would actually spread out the tension on your anastomosis. So barbed wires V-lock is actually quite good for doing a bronchial anastomosis, and someday if you get your hand on it, you should try it. It's a nice tool.
What is it made of, Zamir?
It's just like Vicryl. It's Vicryl stroke PDS. I don't remember the exact constituent. The structure of it is that it has got multiple barbs on it. So within the thread, it has got cuts on it, which are unidirectional. So when you go in, it goes in very smoothly, but it cannot slip out. So it stays there. So it's it's got a little hook at the end. It's got a little loop at the end. So you don't even have to tie any knots with a barbed wire. You actually just slip it through the first stitch you go, and you come out on the other side and you slip it through the loop, and the loop tightens, and then you just continue suturing. You don't have to finish it with a knot. It just stays there as it is.
You know, I trained in a little bit. Yeah, I trained in robotic for CABG, and there we used to have something like a spring. You just put it in and you cut it and it closed itself.
Yeah, so I know. I remember that springs were available. At this moment, we don't have endobronchial staplers available. Yes. There is a lot of trials going on endobronchial staplers. We have looked at it. I have been involved with a couple of them, but they are not yet ready for the market. Like your esophageal stapler, like an oropharyngeal stapler, the bronchus, we haven't got that stapler as yet available in the market. But I think there is at least 2 that I know of who are looking at that work in the labs. So that might come in. We don't know. Now, my question to you, sir, is what about lymph node dissection in carcinoid tumors? What is your philosophy on lymph node dissection in carcinoid tumors?
See, firstly, you already have a CT scan, so that gives you an idea about lymph node involvement. But otherwise, like for any malignancy, it's you have to dissect out the lymph nodes and send them for frozen section, of course.
Sure. So it's a good idea. I like that concept, sir. I think we should do lymph node dissection for all carcinoids. You'll be surprised the number of times a lymph node will eventually come back positive. So what you think is a typical carcinoid will suddenly become an atypical carcinoid. And you might have to send them for post-operative, either radiotherapy or chemotherapy in that area. And now with the onset of bevacizumab, more and more of these people are being given targeted therapy. So lymph node dissection, the only place where you are allowed not to do a lymph node dissection is in a peripherally placed small carcinoid less than 2 centimeters. So a small peripherally placed where you're just going to wedge it out or do a small segmentectomy, that's okay. But anything that is central, you must actually do a lymph node dissection. That is the recommendation of almost all the papers, because there is evidence that at least 30% of these can come back with metastases in the lymph nodes. So you got to be careful about that. So it is important to do a lymph node dissection. I'll just take some questions from the audience, and then I'll come back on endobronchial therapies as well. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the first question is, how do you ventilate the ipsilateral lung during sleeve resection and while waiting for frozen section? Ipsilateral, you don't need to ventilate.
I think
he meant probably contralateral. I think he's asking.
No. He means the site which is being operated upon. And in the video, I showed that my colleagues very enthusiastically put in an endotracheal tube into the bronchus on the left side.
Okay.
And we don't need to do it actually, because other lung is fairly okay. But if you had to, yes, there's no problem.
Yeah.
Just take a sterile endotracheal tube, which is sterile anyway, and put it in. And while you're waiting for the frozen section, you can ventilate it, definitely.
And you also have the option of cross-field ventilation, so you can do that. Okay. Will we not think of getting a DOTA PET scan? We've answered that, so that's fine. We've said that everybody should have a DOTA PET. Can you comment on cardiopulmonary bypass for sleeve resections?
See that if in case you land up in a major problem, and I can't think of what you could land up in, that you're not able to ventilate, your oxygenation is going down, and if your open bronchus or the carina has sort of disappeared from view, then maybe you would like to do. I frankly don't see any reason for doing it. I can't think of any reason.
Yeah, the only case where I had to use a cardiopulmonary bypass was a redo left main bronchus sleeve for a tuberculous stricture. But in a normal carcinoid, I have never used a cardiopulmonary. You can very easily get a very nice and clean dissection margin without worrying about ventilation. So the next question was, what do you do about lymph nodes? We've discussed that. The next thing is, actor Irfan Khan has which neuroendocrine? Is that G3? I don't know. I'm not privy to his medical reports. Sir, do you know?
No. Actually, yes. It's in the common public field. It was an appendicular tumor to begin with. So that's what it was.
I see. Okay.
Yes.
Must be G3. I don't know.
Yes.
Is that patient still operated if hepatic Mets and carcinoid syndrome is present? He's asking about your patient, sir. Would you have operated on that patient if hepatic Mets and carcinoid syndrome was present?
Hepatic Mets and carcinoid. What we are privileged now is that you have a tumor board, and I would have put it to the tumor board, get the opinion of my radiotherapist and oncologist. Immediately, I cannot think of an answer. Yes, if the surgical part is fine, the advantage of a carcinoid G1, at least if you would talk of that, is that you can do a resection and spare the lung. But again, I would like to stress that please, if you're doing oncosurgery, have a tumor board. There's so many things you learn from your radiotherapist and your oncologist. So I think we would I would take the opinion of these two people. I'm not sure what the answer would be.
No, I think, Vikas, what we would do is we would actually resect the lung one, and it depends on how many mets are there in the liver. If it's a solitary met in the liver, then you would resect that as well and give the patient post-operative chemotherapy. If there's multiple mets, then that's a different situation. Then you go down the route of chemotherapy. But these are not very chemosensitive tumors. That is the issue. So the current generation drugs are showing some promise. But if there's single met, I would resect both of them. If there is multiple mets, I would still resect the chest one, because the chest one is going to give him symptoms. It is going to block off that left main bronchus and he will lose his lung. So if it's just a localized thing intrabronchially, we could resect it, or we could do endobronchial therapy. We haven't discussed that as yet. So we're going to talk about it after we finish the questions. Just a little bit about endobronchial therapy, whether there's any role or not.
Can I just ask you, Zamir, how good or how active is your tumor board? I presume
very
it must be.
Very active.
And
Seriously,
I think we learn a lot from interacting with people in this.
Sir, we are not allowed to operate. We are not allowed to operate on any cancer without tumor board. That is the rule of the country. We cannot. It is mandatory.
Yes.
Okay.
It's coming in here too. Most of our institutes, we have it.
So Shubham is asking us, how do you decide whether you want to do a thoracotomy or a sternotomy for tracheal surgery?
For tracheal?
Yeah.
For tracheal, if it's the lower trachea, lower part of trachea, you mean any tracheal surgery, or you mean a surgery of a tracheal?
I am presuming that, Shubham, you can come in and ask the question. Do you mean sleeve resections, or do you mean tracheal surgery? Because tracheal surgery is not fair to ask Dr. Bedi that question.
Good evening, sir. So the question was that whenever we come across sleeve resections, reaching up to the carina is a challenge. So would we consider a right thoracotomy or a sternotomy to reach to that midline area? Or is it for the right side it's different, for the left side it's different? That's my question actually.
Yeah, my preferred route for a sleeve is through a lateral approach, and only if I'm doing high tracheal work that we would come from the midline. Because from the right side you can go all the way to the left side, and from the left side you can go all the way to the right side and the carina. So even for carina you can approach very well from the lateral aspect. So my approach for any sleeves is always lateral. I never come in with a sternotomy. I have not had to do it so far.
The video sir showed was a midline one. That's why just the confusion, because we would also use a lateral approach for that. So
okay. Did you use a midline approach for something, sir? No. His video was thoracotomy. Maybe you
were left and right.
Yeah.
Both were.
They were both thoracotomies actually.
Yes.
So Rohit Kumar is asking, do small cell carcinomas and large cell undifferentiated carcinomas a type of neuroendocrine tumor, and do the management differ in them? This is an oncology question. I would actually answer you saying that yes, they are both types of neuroendocrine tumors, but they are predominantly sensitive, chemosensitive. So they have a different role. Surgery has a very limited role in small cell carcinoma. Only for peripherally placed stage 1 tumors, you actually do a surgical resection. Otherwise, all small cell carcinomas go to the oncologist and they give chemotherapy. So the question is, again, same thing, cardiopulmonary bypass for sleeve resection, you've already answered. For left main bronchial sleeve, this is a very good question. I like this. For left main bronchial sleeve, is it better, or isn't it better to debulk the tumor endobronchially to allow collapsed lung to expand, followed by stage sleeve in second surgery? So he's saying, should you go in first endobronchially, take out whatever is there, and then do a stage sleeve?
I think I did mention this, that what are the indications for endobronchial, besides, if it's a very small tumor with a prognostically very slow growing, you could do that, or if it's just a palliation. Now, to answer your question, yes, that was the third indication. that you could, debulk it or at least get access to the distal airway so you could ventilate that. I've never had to do that, but theoretically, yes, you could do that. What do you think, Zamir?
No, my take on this is different. Actually, my take is endobronchial works when you are talking about palliation, as in the guy has come with complete collapse, consolidation, shortness of breath, stridor, and you are trying to do palliation. That is a different ballgame. The problem in a completely resectable carcinoid is that the moment you do endobronchial surgery, your subsequent surgery becomes difficult because you might use laser, you might use cryo on that area, and then you are going to go back and anastomose, do an anastomosis in a fibrotic scarred area. So that is why I do not allow my pulmonologists to actually do endobronchial therapies, or I personally as well do not. The lung, which is collapsed distal to the carcinoid, is actually healthy lung. And very often, if you can get a good sleeve resection, the lung comes up. Lung is very forgiving. And even though it may be collapsed for a long period of time, it does come up. So endobronchially, to try to get the lung up first and then go in and do surgery actually is counterintuitive. It doesn't, your suturing in a previously lasered or a previously cryotherapy area is actually compromised. You have a risk of leak, and you have a risk of your sutures not staying. So it's better to go for primary surgery rather than endobronchial. The only indication for endobronchial, actually there are two indications. One is a small, tiny pedicled carcinoid. So the pedicle is very important. If it is a narrow-based pedicle, endobronchially you snare it and it comes out. Or you use laser or you use cryotherapy. But if it is broad-based, or if it has got a large extra bronchial element, then cryotherapy has no role. Then endobronchial therapy has no role. The only other place is when you're doing it for palliation, which means that you're trying, the guy has come with stridor and he's really short of breath, and you're just trying to get him to, start breathing. That is when you do endobronchial. So endobronchial, though the pulmonologists love to use their tools, I personally think that you should not allow them to do it because we can give excellent results with surgery. I mean, you saw Dr. Bedi showing such a beautiful resection, clear margin, perfect anastomosis. But if somebody had put fibrosis in that area, his suturing would have got compromised. So it's not worth it, is my take on it. So Bhushan's asking us, if a patient comes to the OPD with a PET scan done and a biopsy comes out carcinoid, PET scan, the tumor has SUV max of around 8, and it is the only tumor seen in PET scan. Should we still do a DOTA knock in the pre-op? Shall I answer this, sir? Shall I just give him some words of advice on this? You see, the DOTA knock works very well for carcinoid, which is true. But FDG PET also gives you localization. It's not that FDG PET is completely useless in carcinoid surgery. So if you've got a PET already done and it's a localized tumor, I would actually not want to do a DOTA knock. I'd just carry on and do a therapeutic option for this patient. But if I'm worried, or if he's got carcinoid syndrome, or he's got some suggestion that this could be spread to other areas, then I would repeat a DOTA knock. But in a straightforward case, I would take the PET scan, FDG PET, and just carry on and do the surgery. Shubham is asking you, sir, in locally advanced lung cancers, not just carcinoids, if there is some vascular involvement as well, we might need double sleeves. How do we decide for operability?
Yeah, I think I showed you that one slide of double sleeve, and I would see it's obviously a locally advanced once the pulmonary artery is involved. So the decision to do would be, you have to take the patient also into the whole consent thing. And it's doable if there's a short segment of the pulmonary artery, it's doable. The lymph nodes, if they are not, there's no distant metastasis, it is only a local spread, it's a young patient, then of course, and you would like to conserve tissue, you could do it. Of course, if you didn't, you could just do a pneumonectomy. But since if the local lesion of the primary lesion is still limited to the left main bronchus, and you feel that you should be able to anastomose the rest of the bronchus to the carina, then you can go ahead with this. When you clamp the pulmonary artery, you could have a problem. This might be one indication for maybe a limited cardiopulmonary bypass, maybe. That when you clamp the pulmonary artery, you may not also. So you should be ready for a CPB if required. Can be done.
Sure. Yeah, I think the answer to your question would be probably, it depends on two things. One is your tumor board, and number two is how confident is the surgeon. If your tumor board allows you to do, and you are a very confident surgeon, somebody like Diego who does vascular sleeves every day, then you can be pretty radical. If your tumor board is conservative, then they will not allow you to do, crazy stuff when the PA is involved. They will want to get involved. So I think the decision is how radical can you be? It completely depends on the skill of the surgeon and the tumor board allowing you to do it. So Dr. Singh is asking you, sir, could you throw some lights on technical suturing aspects of a bronchoplasty, since multiple rings are cut at different sizes and levels? I think it's probably talking about how do you approximate two different size tubes together.
There is something called telescoping, and there's something called spacing of the sutures. And mostly it is an eyeballing, and unless there's a huge discrepancy, which should not be there because you're just dissecting a small sleeve. If there's a big discrepancy, then it could be challenging. Otherwise, it's generally not much of a problem. You can eyeball it. You start with the cartilaginous part, and then you can telescope the membranous part to some extent.
All right.
Not really very difficult. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Ramaswamy has been reading literature, sir, because he's asking you to explain the procedure of Bedi IMA buttress.
So this is something that we just thought of while we were operating. It was a bad case. The anastomosis we were able to manage, and we needed a buttress. We had not planned for an intercostal muscle flap, and since I have been trained, or all of us maybe have been trained in some minimal access surgery where we dissect the IMA through the chest. And the IMA was lying right in front of me, and it has a huge muscle, as much as you want. You can have 2 millimeter, you can have more than that, and it's a vascularized pedicle. So what we did was we took down that the whole IMA right down to the distal end, and it gives a beautiful length, excellent muscle, and it's viable. It's very vascular. It can reach almost any part of the lung where you have done the resection. So, and now we published it also. And this was in fact picked up as one of 3 surgical innovations by the British Medical Journal 2 years back. And now we do it electively now, except, like this, where it's a clean case, it's a left-sided tumor, and it's well covered with vascular tissue. Anybody else, anything else, especially if a bad diabetic, if it's a post-radiotherapy, or you're not happy with your vascularity of the anastomosis that you've done, I would recommend that it takes 5 minutes. For any one of us, we are well trained in it. You have it right in front of you. The exposure is better than if you've done a sternotomy. So just take down the IMA and put it very gently and stitch it with 4-0-Prolene around the anastomosis. Okay. So that's a Bedi. We call it a Bedi IMA.
Yeah, I like that. Very nice. The other question Ramaswamy is asking you is carcinoids at the level of the secondary carina on the left side. Do you prefer to take control of the superior pulmonary vein prior to division and taking a sleeve of the bronchus?
Why would you need to do that? You're worried about the proximity of the pulmonary vein. Why would you need to isolate the pulmonary vein?
Ramaswamy, you can come in and ask the question. So we are not clear what your question is.
Yeah, sir. Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
fantastic lecture, sir. Thank you. Sir, the structure which is just anterior to the left main bronchus, close to the secondary carina, is the superior pulmonary vein. So if we take the superior pulmonary vein, control will be more confident to go around the bronchus. That was my.
Oh, you mean you tape
yeah,
the
tape the
superior canal. Oh,
tape
yes.
the
And anything which is vital and which needs to be preserved, you tape it and retract it gently. The key word here is gentle. So,
okay.
And I what I use the word to my assistants is shiddat se. You understand shiddat?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you retract it gently, but it has to be retracted. I mean, so it's damned if you do, and the assistant is always worried is it's too much retraction or too little retraction, because pulmonary vein can be a little, and of course pulmonary artery can be very friable. So you have to be careful. Yes, you can tape it. I don't see any problem with not taping it. Yeah.
So
Thank you.
but
Thank you, sir.
thank you, Ramaswamy. Danesh Kumar is asking about Ki67 index. Shall I take this question, sir?
Yes,
Shall I help him with
please.
this? So
Absolutely.
Ki67, Danesh, is a cellular marker for proliferation, which is present during the active phase of cell division. So we are talking about G1, G2 mitosis, okay? So Ki67 is a good marker for that. And measuring the Ki67 index actually divides all carcinoids into 4 groups. So if you go from 0.38% to about 12%, that's a typical carcinoid. The second is atypical. So the higher the Ki differentiation happens, the more is the range. You can actually say that this is typical or atypical carcinoid. So it's like an immunomarker. So 0 to 12 is typical, 4 to 30 is atypical, 30 to 93 is is the neuroendocrine carcinoma, and if it's 96 or 100%, then it's a small cell lung cancer. So that is how you use Ki67 in differentiating between the thing. It's a marker which is used to identify the type of thing. It's like immunohistochemistry for carcinoids. Is it possible? Parth Solanki is asking: is it possible to dissect IMA through a thoracotomy without mini sternotomy MICS instruments?
Actually, if you've done a thoracotomy, it's lying right in front of you. All you need is a little longer forceps, which most OTs have, and you need a cautery tip, which is a little longer. You don't need anything else, and you need the Liga clips.
So Dr. Singh is asking: is it good to sacrifice IMA when other tissues are available?
Yes. See, we did a literature search, and there have been no published reports of any patient who has been operated for lung and who has needed a CABG. It's possible, of course, that a patient who has been operated for the lung can need a CABG. So now what we do is, in our patients, we get a cardiologist, independent cardiologist, to assess the patient that is he a high risk for needing some cardiac intervention. So obviously, if it's a 55-year-old person, we'll do an angiogram. So if the angiogram shows even a start of some disease, then we would not be using. So in any patient where you feel that he will be needing a CABG, we would not use it. Other than that, I don't see any problem of using one internal mammary artery. Should not be an issue. Yes.
So I just want to make a comment for the youngsters in terms of carcinoids, that a small endobronchial carcinoid is okay. It is easy enough to get in there and take it out. Most of the problems is when we deal with extrabronchial carcinoids, because very often these tumors are really large extrabronchially with a small endobronchial element. And the place where it grows is usually retrocardiac. It grows into that, goes behind into the posterior mediastinum and starts to grow in an area behind the heart. And so very often when you go in trying to do sleeve resections, it is the dissection at the back of the LA where you've got to take away all of that extrabronchial margin, all of that extrabronchial carcinoid. That is the difficult part. But if you can free it from the back of the LA, because it's usually not stuck there, it's just growing into that area, then you can bring it out and you can still do a carcinoma, you can still do a sleeve. Sometimes you have to compromise that and you have to actually do a lung resection along with it. So just to get the clear margins. The problem is, as Sir said, you do a frozen section, you get negative, you've done a sleeve, you got away. That's okay. The problem is you have a young patient and you've done a sleeve resection and the margin comes back positive and you're really close to the carina. And so then you're left with the question, should you do a complex carinal resection or should you do a pneumonectomy in this patient? That is actually a very difficult situation. And yes, complex carinal resections you can do, but doing a pneumonectomy is usually not justified. You want to actually save the lung as far as possible. So we have actually experienced with that. And now what we do is when we have got the proximal margin positive and the next step is pneumonectomy, no other option, then we do the anastomosis and we give post-operative radiotherapy. We've done about 4 cases like this and all of them seem to have responded well to radiotherapy. You should not give radiotherapy for the first 3 months and these have to be low-grade carcinoids. You cannot do this for a high-grade carcinoid. In a high-grade carcinoid, your anastomosis will not take. So we have done this for low-grade carcinoids where the proximal margin either came positive very close to the carina or afterwards the histology came back as positive. And we have given them post-operative radiotherapy to that localized area. And all the patients actually are surviving with no evidence of recurrence in this group. So the newer concepts of radiotherapy seem to be working with the carcinoid cells. Particularly the lutetium-177 specifically attacks the SSTR receptors, and that might work for carcinoid. So, try to avoid a pneumonectomy. That's what I'm trying to say. Try to avoid a pneumonectomy. You can do a suboptimal surgery with an R1 resection and have additional radiotherapy given post-operatively. These are sort of newer thought processes that are coming in the carcinoid world. So do you have any thoughts on that? Any different you would want to state on that?
Well, I spoke with my radiotherapist and oncologist, and those last 2 slides, which I gave what you're talking about, and which I had, and there's no personal experience, but they said these are 2 things which are coming, and the newer drugs, the octreotide type drugs, is better than octreotide. They are coming in, and they have been found to be good for pancreatic nets, and they possibly, if you had a bronchial net, you would use it in such a case. Yes, no personal experience.
No, actually, my series is with Dr. Kataria in Medanta, so she does a lot of these things, and she's pretty good at giving post-operative radiotherapy. Excellent results in our group. Okay, thank you very much, sir. One last question we just mentioned was endobronchial therapy. We were just talking about should we do endobronchial therapy. I think I clarified in the earlier talk, is that only you should do endobronchial when there are narrow-based carcinoids. In broad-based carcinoids, they're not good treatments because they do cause scarring and they do cause fibrosis, and a subsequent surgery becomes a problem in future. And what could have potentially been a sleeve may end up being a pneumonectomy. Hence, we got to be a little careful about endobronchial therapy for carcinoids. Any more questions? If somebody's got anything else, we are happy to ask Dr. Bedi. No more questions. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bedi. It's been indeed a pleasure to have you on this group. We've really enjoyed your talk, and I think the slides were beautifully done up, beautiful videos, very clear demonstration of your technique, and I'm pretty certain if these guys get a carcinoid tumor in their exams, they will thank you for it. So thank you once again.
Okay.